So in the second year, the learning phonological contrast, in this stage, they begin to differentiate between speech sounds that are distinct in their language but may be hard to perceive or produce at first. So, a key developmental milestones in the ability to distinguish and produce contrast between similar phonemes. For example, P and B, the letter P and B are both plosives. As I mentioned earlier, they are produced by blocking and then releasing airflow. But the distinction is that P, the letter P or P, is voiceless, like it has no vocal cord vibration. While the B is voiced, like vocal cords vibrate. Both sounds are produced in the same part of the mouth, which is the lips, but they differ in terms of voicing. During this time, toddlers begin to recognize these types of phonemic contrast in their speech and start to incorporate them into their own production. They will often attempt to use them, but they still might have errors, like they are confused in the P and B, or letter P and B, or using one sound in place of another. Example, they might say bat as pat. Another example is a child who says pat and bat will learn to use the difference between the letter P and B, or P and B, to distinguish between two separate words, even though their motor control of speech may not be fully refined. Like this period marks the transition from being primarily receptive to sound, receptive means understanding the sounds they hear, to being more productive, or productive means beginning to use the sounds themselves. By the end of the second year, children are well on their way to mastering the basic sound and contrast in their language, setting the foundation for more complex phonological and linguistic development in the years to come. In the concept of child's pronunciation versus adult forms, it refers to the idea that children may be able to comprehend and store adult-like word forms in their mental lexicon. Their spoken pronunciation may not always match the adult forms due to developmental factors. So in terms of their phonological development, young children often produce sounds that are acoustically different from adult forms due to the developmental stages of their speech apparatus, like their tongue position, vocal tract shape. For example, a child might produce the words wing and ring in a way that it sounds very similar, like both might sound closer to wing. Even though these words differ in adult speech by the initial consonant sound, the W and R, the letter W versus the letter R. In the sound substitution, in early stage of language acquisition, children may substitute one sound for another that is easier for them to produce. This might lead to phonemic simplification, such as dropping or replacing certain consonants or vowels. Like for example, a child might produce the word wing as something more like wing or win, which simplifies the phonemic production. In the example of a child pronouncing mouth as mouse, in the phonological process, the example of mouth being pronounced as mouse shows how children often employ phonological processes like the vowel simplification or consonant assimilation. So in this case, the child might be using a more familiar, easier vowel sound, like instead of the th or the th sound, they will be replaced it with the s sound instead. So this is a typical part of language acquisition where children's pronunciation may reflect simplification that are not yet in line with the more complex adult forms. Next is the children's lexical presentation may be closer to adult forms than their pronunciation. So even though a child might not pronounce words like an adult, their mental representation of those words, like how they understand and store them in their memory, may be closer to the adult form. This means that the child has an adult-like understanding of the word and its meaning, even if the physical production of the word is simplified or altered. So this distinction highlights that speech production and speech comprehension can develop at different rates. Children may be able to recognize and understand the adult form of words before they can accurately produce those words. Like, for example, a child may understand the word mouth and know it refers to the part of the body, but their physical articulation of the word might be inaccurate or simplified, as in the example of the word mouse. Mouth, they will pronounce it as mouse instead of mouth. In patterns and pronunciation, it refers to the systematic ways in which children simplify the sound of words during their language development. So this mispronunciation often follow a consistent predictable patterns rather than being random errors. So there are 3 key points of the patterns in mispronunciation. Number 1 is the substitution reflects simplification for easier articulation. So as children learn to speak, they don't have the motor skills or full control over their vocal tract that adults do. So this leads to simplified articulation of more complex sound. Rather than producing full adult pronunciation of words, the children often substitute sound that are easier for them to say based on their current level of speech development. In the motor constraints, children's speech apparatus like their tongue, lips, and vocal cords is still developing, and certain sounds require more precise control and coordination. So this can lead to a simplification of sound to make them easier to produce. For example, a child might find it easier to produce a t sound rather than a th or th sound. So they may say two instead of two. Next is the common substitution. Glides for liquids, alveolars for dentals. So the glides for liquids, it is one of the common pattern in children's speech, and it is the substitution of glides. Glides is glides such as the letter W and J. For liquids like the letter R and L, glides are easier for children to produce because they require less and precise tongue positioning. For example, a child might say rabbit as wibbit instead of rabbit, replacing the liquid r with the glide w. So another example is a child saying yellow as jewo instead of lelo, replacing the L with the glide J. So the alveolars for dental, so it is another common substitution, involves replacing dental sound with alveolar sound, like the T sound and D or the D sound. So dentals produce with the tongue against the upper teeth because it can be harder for children to produce than alveolars, which are made with the tongue on the alveolar ridge just behind the teeth. For example, a child might say thumb as thumb instead of thumb, replacing the dental TH sound or the th sound with the alveolar t or T. So this might be pronounced as this instead of this. So that is the alveolars for dentals. The next one or the third one is the rule govern nature of phonological substitution in children. So in the systematic patterns, the phonological substitution children make the rule governed, meaning that they follow a certain phonological rules or patterns that are consistent across different words and situation. So these patterns are not random, but instead it reflects the child's developing and understanding of how sounds are produced. For example, a child might regularly substitute sound r with w across many words, such as saying rain as wane, rad as web, and frog as fwog. So this shows that the child is following a systematic rule, substituting the r sound with the w sound in a predictable way. So let's proceed into the case study of Michael's lexicon. So in a case of a young child named Michael, we observed specific patterns in how he pronounces words. Like these patterns reveal how much the typical development of phonological skills in early childhood, including the simplifications, substitutions, and the application of phonological rules that reflect his developmental stage. So number one is the example of substitutions and simplification. So in this example, we observe that Michael pronounces his name Michael as Maitel or M-A-I-T-L or Maitel. So this is a classic example of how children simplify adult pronunciation to make them easier to articulate. Next is the devoicing and reducing consonant clusters. Example, Bart for big bird. So, in the case of Michael saying Bart for big bird, one common phonological pattern that we observe is devoicing. Devoicing occurs when a sound that is normally voiced is replaced by a voiceless counterpart, like the sound p or t. So, the voiced b sound in big is replaced with the voiceless p sound, so the child may be simplifying the articulation by producing a sound that is easier for them to produce. Next is the preference for simple consonant vowel syllables and age-appropriate phonological rules. So, in the early language development, there is preference for simple CV or the consonant vowel syllables. In this case, Michael might be saying ba for ball or ma for mommy because the CV structure like the ba and ma is easier to produce than more complex syllables like the CVC or the consonant vowel consonant or CCVC or CCVCC. So this preference reflects the fact that young children generally begin by using simple syllable structure which are easier to articulate. So let's go ahead onto the next topic, which is the phonological rules in early language development. So in early childhood, children simplify complex adult language forms using the systematic phonological rules. Like these rules help them reduce the complexity of the words, making them easier to pronounce given their developing their speech abilities. These rules are part of their natural process of language acquisition, and they mirror their phonological process found in adult languages, though there are simplified versions. So